There's a question that visits some people at 3 in the morning. Not the question of whether they still believe, but something quieter and harder. What if the ground they've been standing on was never as solid as they thought? And what does that make the last 40 years? You don't say it out loud. You're not sure you'd even call it doubt. It's more like a pressure, the kind that builds when you've spent a lifetime defending something you know is true, but can never quite explain why you know it. And somewhere along the way, someone, a grandchild, a colleague, a voice on the television said, "There's no proof." And you didn't have an answer. And the silence sat with you longer than you expected. Here is what almost nobody tells you about that moment. The greatest philosopher of the modern era, a man who spent 50 years thinking harder about reason than any thinker before or since, arrived at exactly that silence. He walked into it on purpose. He looked at every argument humanity had constructed for the existence of God, dismantled them one by one, and concluded that theoretical reason cannot prove God exists. And then he said something that almost no one quotes in the same breath. That was the point. Because Immanuel Kant also said, and this is the thing that will reorganize what you thought you knew about him, about doubt and about faith, that a God who could be proven by argument could also be disproven by argument. And if that's the God you're standing on, you are one clever philosopher away from losing everything. Stay with me, because the man your critics cite to shake your faith is the man who, more than anyone in the modern world, built the case that faith properly understood cannot be shaken by any argument at all. We're going to get there. But first, you need to understand what he actually destroyed and why. For 2,000 years, Western philosophy produced what were called the proofs for God's existence. Not suggestions, not arguments you could take or leave. Proofs, the same word used for geometry, for logic, for things that follow necessarily from the nature of reality. The most famous came from medieval theology. The cosmological argument, everything that exists has a cause. You can't have an infinite chain of causes. Therefore, there must be a first cause, uncaused, and that is God. The ontological argument from Anselm of Canterbury. God is the greatest conceivable being. A being that exists is greater than one that doesn't, therefore God must exist. The teleological argument, the one most people find intuitively compelling. The universe shows evidence of design, the eye, the orbit of planets, the precise conditions for life. And design implies a designer. These arguments were the intellectual foundation of centuries of Christian apologetics. Educated Christians believed that reason, pursued far enough, would arrive at God. Kant took them apart. Not carelessly, not with contempt. With the kind of thoroughness that only comes from a man who understood exactly what he was doing and why it had to be done. His argument, laid out in the Critique of Pure Reason, which he published when he was 57 years old, after a decade of near silence that most people assumed meant he had nothing left to say, was precise. He said that human reason has a structure. It can operate legitimately within the domain of possible experience, the world we can observe, measure, test. But when it tries to reach beyond that domain, into things like the ultimate origin of the universe or the existence of a being outside space and time, it produces what he called antinomies, contradictions that look like valid arguments on both sides. You can construct a proof that the universe had a beginning. You can construct an equally valid proof that it didn't. Both arguments follow the rules of logic. Both lead to opposite conclusions. That, Kant said, is the signal that reason has stepped outside its proper territory. The proofs for God, all of them, make this mistake. They try to move from the logic of concepts to the existence of a being outside experience. And reason cannot make that move. Not because God doesn't exist, because reason wasn't built for that kind of territory. This is the part that gets misread as an attack on faith. It isn't. It is something harder to understand and, once understood, far more useful. Kant said it himself in the preface to the second edition of that same Critique of Pure Reason. The sentence is one of the most important in the history of philosophy, and it is almost never quoted alongside the demolition of the proofs, even though it explains why he demolished them. He wrote, "I had to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith." Read that again. He denied knowledge. He limited what theoretical reason can claim in order to make room for faith, not to eliminate it, not to replace it with something secular, to protect it from what he saw as its greatest enemy, the attempt to prove it. Because here is what Kant understood about the proofs, and what the history of the last 2 centuries has confirmed. If you stake your faith on an argument, you are only as secure as the argument. And every argument has a counter-argument. Every proof can be questioned. Every chain of logic has a weak link that a determined skeptic can find. When you build the house of God on the foundation of intellectual demonstration, you have handed your critic the same tool you're using. And the critics have not been idle. Kant's demolition of the proofs was not an assault on the house. It was the removal of a foundation that was always going to crack, so that something more durable could be put in its place. What he put there is what he called, in the Critique of Practical Reason, a postulate of practical reason. And it is the part of Kant that almost nobody in these conversations ever gets to. A postulate in Kant's sense is not a proven fact. It is not a matter of blind faith either. It is something that rational, morally serious people are required to hold, not because reason can demonstrate it, but because the moral life cannot be lived coherently without it. Kant's argument goes like this. There is a moral law, and he believed this with the conviction of a man whose mother had taught it to him before he had words for it. Anna Regina Reuter, Kant's mother, died when he was 13 years old. She was a pietist, part of a German Protestant tradition that emphasized direct, personal, lived experience of God over ceremony and doctrine. What Kant learned from her was not a list of propositions. It was a form of seriousness about the inner life, about conscience, about what you owe to other people regardless of whether anyone is watching. That formation never left him. And the moral law he identified, the structure of conscience, the demand to treat every human being as an end in themselves and never merely as a means, carries with it a demand that cannot be satisfied within the world we can see and measure. It demands that virtue and happiness ultimately align, that the person who does right does not, in the end, do so for nothing. That justice is not merely a human convention that history can erase. Kant called this alignment the ultimate correspondence of moral worth and genuine well-being, the summum bonum, the highest good. And he argued that the moral law itself, by demanding this alignment, rationally requires us to posit two things: freedom of the will, because you cannot be morally commanded to do what you are not free to do, and God, because only a being with full knowledge of moral worth and full power over outcomes can guarantee that alignment across the whole of existence. He was explicit about what he was and was not claiming. This is not a proof that God exists in the theoretical sense. It does not give you the kind of certainty you get from mathematics or from science. It is rational necessity of a different kind. The person who takes morality seriously, who actually lives as though some things are genuinely right and genuinely wrong, has, Kant argued, already committed themselves to a set of beliefs that includes God, whether they have named it or not. He wrote, in the Critique of Practical Reason, morality thus leads ineluctably to religion, not reluctantly, not as a concession. Ineluctably, as in, there is no path out if you are honest about what the moral life requires. If you have been trying to articulate something you've always believed, but never had the words for, the sense that the person who denies any moral reality isn't just wrong, but is living on borrowed ground. This is part of what you've been reaching for, not because Kant hands you a script, but because he followed the logic of moral seriousness further than almost anyone else ever has, and arrived somewhere that will feel familiar. The argument toolkit in the link below was built for exactly these conversations, the ones at the holiday table or in a text thread that goes sideways, where you know what you believe but lose the thread of why when someone pushes back hard. 12 arguments drawn from Kant's framework for the challenges that come up most often. Not debate tricks, clear, honest reasoning you can actually use. It's in the description if you want it. Now here is the detail that almost no one includes when they tell the story of Kant and religion, and it matters more than the philosophy alone. In 1794, Kant was 70 years old. He had spent his life in Königsberg, a city in what is now Russia, which he had never once left. He was, by that point, the most famous philosopher in Europe, and he received an official letter from the cabinet of Friedrich Wilhelm II, King of Prussia, demanding that he stop writing about religion. The government accused him of misusing his philosophy to undermine fundamental doctrines of Christianity. They were not gentle about it. The letter made clear that continued writing on the subject would expose him to unpleasant measures. Kant complied while the king lived. He signed a letter of submission. And then, after Friedrich Wilhelm II died in 1797, he published his thoughts on the matter openly, including a full account of what had happened. A man who had destroyed God would not have needed silencing by a king. A man whose philosophy was harmless to faith would not have been censored by a government that wanted Christianity protected. Friedrich Wilhelm II's censors understood something that the secular narrative about Kant refuses to admit. This was a man who had written about God and morality and the inner life of faith with enough force and seriousness that the authorities found him dangerous. Not dangerous because he had removed God. Dangerous because he had put God somewhere a philosopher couldn't reach, which meant, by the same logic, that a philosopher couldn't remove him either. Here is where the inversion completes, and it requires you to hold two things at once. Kant was right that the classical proofs fail. He was right that theoretical reason cannot establish God's existence. If your faith has been resting on the cosmological argument or the teleological argument, Kant's critique is sound, and there is no version of those proofs that survives it intact. That is simply the honest position, and the channel will not pretend otherwise. And Kant was also right, rigorously, systematically right, that this changes nothing about the rationality of faith. Because faith, properly understood, was never in reason's jurisdiction to begin with. Think about what it means that the proofs fail. It means that no skeptic, however brilliant, can use theoretical reason to establish that God does not exist. The same limits that prevent proof prevent disproof. Kant was explicit about this. In his 1786 essay, What Does It Mean to Orient Oneself in Thinking? He argued that both dogmatic theism, claiming to prove God, and dogmatic atheism, claiming to disprove God, exceed what reason can legitimately claim. The honest atheist and the honest believer are in the same epistemic position with respect to theoretical proof. Neither has it. What the believer has, and the atheist does not, is the practical argument. The argument that the moral life, taken seriously, rationally requires God. And that argument does not sit in the court where reason wins and loses. It sits in the court of what you have to believe if you are going to live as though anything actually matters. The person who comes to your table with philosophy and statistics and the latest arguments against religion has, if Kant is right, already conceded the most important point, because they are appealing to you as a rational person, as someone who can recognize a good argument, as someone who cares about what is true. That appeal is itself a moral act, and a moral act already stands on ground that Kant says leads, ineluctably, to God. This is not a trick. It is not a rhetorical move designed to win an argument. It is what happens when you follow the logic of moral seriousness to its end, which is what Kant did. Carefully, over decades, in a cold city he never left, walking the same streets at the same hour every day, thinking. He wrote in the conclusion to the Critique of Practical Reason, what may be the most quoted line in all of his work. Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and reverence, the more often and more steadily one reflects on them. The starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. The starry heavens, the vastness of the physical universe, which reason can map but cannot ultimately explain. The moral law within, the quiet, insistent demand of conscience, which no external authority installed there and no argument can fully account for. Both, to Kant, pointed in the same direction. Neither could be proved. Both could be denied, technically, if you were willing to live with the consequences. But the person who has spent 40 or 50 or 60 years trying to live rightly, who has made the hard choices when the easy ones were available, who has kept the faith when keeping it cost something, who has loved people through the stages of life where love requires more than feeling, that person already knows something. Not as a theorem, as a life. The doubt that visits at 3 in the morning is not a sign that the ground is giving way. It may be the sign that you were standing on ground that was always thinner than what you deserved, and that something sturdier has been available all along. Kant didn't give you permission to believe. He gave you the argument that the people trying to take it away have already lost. They just don't know it yet. There's a question I want to leave you with, not a philosophical one, a personal one. If you could name one conviction, one thing you have held for decades, one thing you have lived by without being able to fully explain why, what would it be? Not the doctrine, not the tradition, the thing underneath. The thing that stayed even in the years when the practice was hard and the community was absent and the certainty was thinner than you wanted it to be. I'd like to know what that is. Leave it in the comments. Because that, more than anything else you could say, is the place where Kant says the argument actually begins.